Welcome once again to yet another lesson in English. I am teacher Kazembe from Fountain School. Alright, so in English we are still looking at direct and indirect speech, of which in the previous lesson that we had, we were looking at indirect speech. And we looked at different things and the guidelines on how to change direct speech to indirect speech. For example, I can say, when we say, John said John said, I love my father. I love my father. This sentence is in direct speech. It is showing what John said, the exact way that John said. But last time we discussed on how to change this, of which always I say, always you should start with the unspoken words. So we'll say, John said, and then I will introduce the spoken words with that. That's what we discussed. Said that, and then the I will change. Since John is a boy or a male, we'll say, said that he. Love will change. It's a tense that is in present, and it will change now to past tense. We'll say, loved. My will change to his, since we are reporting his father. This is what we discussed last time. But today we're going to look at now changing questions to reported speech. So today, our lesson for today is simply changing questions to reported. Reported speech. Alright, so this is the lesson for today. But remember the previous lesson, what we are doing. Now, changing questions to reported speech. Reported speech is also called indirect speech. So it's just the same. We have to know that there are two types or two kinds of questions. So we are going to look at that. Now, the two kinds of questions, we have the types of questions that begins with interrogatives. Okay, so when we talk of interrogatives, these are simply words such as what, which, where, who, why, whose, and so on. So these, when you see these words, these are simply the interrogative words or the interrogatives. So we have questions that begins with interrogatives. So another question is B, the questions that begins with auxiliary or helping verbs. So when you talk of auxiliary or helping verbs, these are simply the verbs such as has, have, is, was, where, does, did, and many more. Okay, so now, with this type of questions, we are going now to learn how to change them from direct to indirect speech, following the guidelines that we are following when we are changing from direct to indirect speech. But this time, there is just a little bit of a difference because these are questions. So I'll give one example under questions that begins with interrogatives. I'll give one example of question that begins with interrogatives. For example, I'll say example 1. Remember, questions that begin with interrogatives. So I'll pick the interrogative. Let's try to use where. Okay, so where were you? Where were you when there fire? Where were you when the fire started? I'll just put a simple question here. When the fire started. And remember, when punctuating when punctuating reported speech or punctuating direct speech, always remember that the speech marks are outside the punctuation mark that is just at the end of the sentence. And we say asked, the father. Okay, asked the father. Or to make it simpler, I'll say asked her father, so that we know to be specific. Now, for us to change this sentence, when we look at this sentence it is in direct speech, but it's a question. Now, for us to change it, we need to follow the guidelines. And the guidelines that we're going to follow are just the same, of which we say the tenses will change, even some pronouns, including the verbs and adverbs. But the speech marks are also going. So the first guideline that we followed when we're looking at changing from direct to indirect speech, we say we always start with the unspoken words. So I'll say her father. We are talking about the father. We are talking about the father. Remember, her father asked. Asked who? Who pick is the girl. Her father asked her. But we are not going to introduce the spoken words using that. Remember, we're using that when we are changing those sentences, but this is a question. Therefore, when we are changing the question that has an interrogative word, we do not introduce the spoken word using that. Therefore, we use the interrogative word that is being used in a sentence. So in this case, we have the word where. So it's the one that I'll use. So her father asked her where she was. So where will change to was. Where she was when the fire started. When the fire started. And I'll put a full stop instead of a question mark. This is because this is now an indirect question or a reported what? Speech. Therefore, it does not require an answer and it will not carry the question mark there. It will carry what? A full stop. So these are some of the things that we should remember. Should always remember that when you change to reported speech, always we do not put the question mark there, because this question or this sentence here, it does not require an answer. Therefore, it will carry a full stop. So one thing you should put in consideration is that when introducing the spoken words, always put or start with the word, the interrogative word that is in the question. So if we had what he, I could have used what. If we had who, I could have used who. So these are some of the points that we should follow. And this is how we change questions from direct to indirect speech. What type of question? Questions that begins with interrogatives. Now, we are going also to look at how we can now change questions that begins with auxiliary or helping verbs. So I'm going to give you one example of the question that begins with auxiliary or helping verbs. Okay. Now, example 2. Example 2. For questions that begin with auxiliary or helping verbs, I'll use the word did. So, did you knock on the door? This is the question. And these are spoken words, so I'll put them in speech marks. Asked, or I'll say the giant. The giant man asked Mary. So now, this is the question is different from this one here. This one is carrying the helping verb did. It's not carrying any of the interrogative words. So, to change this one, remember always when you're changing to indirect speech, always start with the unspoken words. So even with this one, I'll start with the unspoken words. Those words that are not in the speech mark, that are not having the speech marks. So these words here are the ones I'm going to start with. So I'll say the giant man asked Mary. But now, here, you can only use the interrogative word there if you are dealing with interrogative questions. But in this case, this is not an interrogative question and it's not having any interrogative word. So for me to introduce the spoken words now, I'm going to use the word whether. We use the word whether. So the giant man asked Mary. I will now say whether. We use the word whether. Whether she, this is in present tense, it will change. Remember, tenses also change. Whether she knocked. Whether she knocked on the door. And then I want to put a question mark also here. I'll put a full stop instead of a question mark. Why? We said when we change to indirect speech, this sentence does not require an answer. Therefore, it is just going to have a full stop instead of a question mark. So this is how we change the two types of sentences. So I've said we have two types of sentences. The sentence that have interrogative words and the sentence that have the auxiliary or the helping verbs. And now I'm going to show you a chart so that we can discuss more on the chart. Okay, so like I said, this is now what we are discussing all together. So remember this point. Indirect question ends with a full stop and not a question mark. This is one thing you should know. This is because they do not require an answer. And I've said there are two types of questions. We have questions that begin with interrogative, e.g., which, who, what, where, why, when, whose. We also have under this same type of questions, I've given an example. This is indirect speech. Where were you when the fire started? And remember, this question, it has speech marks. Asked her father. So for us to change it into indirect speech, I said we have to now remove the speech marks and start with the unspoken words. So we say her father asked her where she was when the fire started. We've used where because it is the interrogative word that is in the sentence, in the question there. Another type of question we've discussed is questions that begins with auxiliary or helping verbs. Example: has, have, is, had, are, should, will, can, did, does, were, was, could, and many more. So example of that one, the question in the sentence in direct speech we have, did you knock on the door? The giant man asked. So equally to change to indirect speech, even with this one, we are going to remove these speech marks. And we will always start with the unspoken words, which are not enclosed in the speech marks. So we say the giant man asked Mary whether she knocked. Remember, this knock will change to the past tense. It will change to knock on the door. So it's very important that we get to remember all this. And now I'm going to give you the exercise. Okay, so the exercise is very simple. So I'm going to give you just a few questions for you to answer. So the question is saying, change the following sentences to reported speech, meaning these are indirect speech. So, question 1, where did you hide the money? Mr. Malama asked the pickpocket. Question 2, did you see the money I had kept under the pillow? Grandmother asked us. Question 3. What bus will take me to Lusaka? The lost passenger asked a stranger. Question 4. Is everyone eating at home today? Is everyone eating at home today? Mrs. Piri asked her family. So these are the few questions that I want you to answer for me. And remember, just follow those guidelines that we are following. And you should first identify if the question is having an interrogative word, or maybe it is having a helping or the auxiliary verb. So it has been your teacher, Mr. Kazembe from Fountain School. Thank you very much.